so hello and welcome everyone. So this video I'm going to talk about rent controls in Oregon. So recent law, 2019, I never thought we would see something like this, but we did. So cool, this is going to provide economists some really interesting data for research. And I'd be really excited if I was a first year PhD student actually. Anyway, so what the law is going to do is limit rent increases to 7% per year plus some adjustment for inflation. Why are they interested in doing this? Well, they're observing that rents are rising faster than wages. So median rent rose 14% statewide, 30% in Portland, adjusting for inflation since 2011. This is coming from New York Times. And so they're trying to respond to this issue that rents are rising and rental units are becoming less and less affordable. Relatedly, Boston's proposing steep taxes on developers to deal with its housing shortage. When I read this, I thought that sounds like a terrible idea. As I read a little bit more, then I learned this detail. They're trying to end this cycle of displacement due to gentrification, where current residents are being priced out by new development that's coming in, and maybe the displaced residents don't have a place to go, or there's different sorts of social, economic, and other sorts of social issues there. So I feel a little bit differently about this when it's reported as, or when we're clear about reporting this as dealing with specifically this problem, versus it sounds like it's just for the state as a whole, which would be a completely different, or for the city as a whole, which would be a completely different story entirely. Anyway, so the problem with the Oregon rent control law, well, prices rise because of scarcity. So if we realize that rents are rising and becoming increasingly unaffordable, the problem is scarcity. So prices can rise either because of an increase in demand, in which case whatever is the desired object or service becomes scarce relative to the large number of people who want it. Or it could be that we're getting a leftward shift to supply, or decrease in supply, in which case you literally have scarcity because there's less and less available of what it is that you want. Either way, prices are going to rise, and it's because of scarcity. There's not enough relative to how much people want. Okay, so how do we deal with scarcity? Well, you want prices to be to provide this incentive for increasing the stock, the availability of whatever it is that people are trying to get, right? You alleviate scarcity by bringing in abundance, right? Okay, so in order to do that, you need the high price, so that there's this reason for suppliers to want to alleviate the abundance. And so my view would be, hey, look, if we've got this problem of rising rents, probably what you want to do is you want to think about policies that are going to lead to greater development in Portland and throughout Oregon. This rent ceiling doesn't seem to accomplish that. It's going to do some other things, and it's well-intentioned, but a lot of them aren't. It's not. So other things equal, we shouldn't be so quick to expect that it's going to satisfy the goals that it's put in place for. So I'm going to begin with a standard Econ 101 criticism, and then I'm going to say that's actually not a good story. So I'm going to say, does this even apply? And there's some intuition from the standard economic world that's going to get us there, but the standard economic 101 model probably doesn't fit here so well. And then I'm going to talk about this, what I'll call this sort of advanced pricing criticism, which is more like a logistic implementation issue. Okay, so just to kind of get a sense of what the 7% price increase is going to allow, it'll allow rent that's currently $1,000 to go to $1,070, or $2,000 maybe for like a one bedroom, and I don't know what housing prices are in Boston, go from $2,000 to $2,140. My guess is actually probably for a nice apartment, you're probably looking at a lot more than this, right? And probably even looking for a not so nice apartment, you're probably looking for a lot more than this. But I don't know. So that's an empirical question. You can check that with Google. That's what Google's for, right? So, okay. So why are rents rising? Well, population growth, right? A lot of people are moving to Oregon. A lot of people are moving to Portland. It's a relatively desirable place to live, and so we have an increase in demand, but the supply hasn't changed. And actually, the housing supply is probably going to be a lot more inelastic than I've drawn here. It's going to be a lot steeper. We should expect the price to rise. Yeah, rents are going to rise, and the quantity demanded is going to rise. Okay, so I'll argue maybe the reason why rents are rising is because you have more people who are interested in buying. So my question first, though, does the standard Econ 101 supply and demand model apply here? This is one of the things that people always sort of get wrong. Even economists are guilty of this. Is running to implement a model, to apply a model, without checking the assumptions and being clear about what the assumptions are. So I'm going to draw a supply and demand model here, and I'm going to use it to give us some insight for how this rent control is going to work. Well, anytime you draw a supply and demand diagram, you are implicitly invoking these assumptions that you have many buyers, many sellers, identical products, free entry and exit, full information, and zero transaction costs. Does that look like the rental market in Boston? No, right? So, you for sure don't have identical products. You for sure don't have full entry and exit, right? And you definitely don't have full information. There's not zero search costs. Yeah, there might be a lot of people interested in selling and renting, especially if you take into consideration, if you could rent an extra room, if we're pretty broad with what we mean by landlord. And there's probably a lot of people searching for apartments, but probably the sellers actually have considerable market power, right? So I say these don't all fit. The supply and demand model is not a perfect fit. So I say, well, the best solution for Oregon is probably let's find ways to get more rental units that alleviate scarcity. Okay, but let's just reflecting on this model and thinking about how this applies here. Does the standard economic model fit with the rental market in Portland? Oh, sorry, I said Boston a second ago. Yeah, it doesn't fit Boston, doesn't fit Portland, doesn't fit Chicago, doesn't fit Detroit, doesn't fit any major metro area, and it certainly doesn't fit any minor metro area or rural area. So does it fit the rental market in Portland? Well, it seems more like landlords probably have substantial market power. In other words, we have to be really cautious interpreting Econ 101 predictions here. Same thing with the minimum wage, right? So the minimum wage standard economic story, Econ 101 story is going to be it's going to cause unemployment. Well, yeah, if you have a binding price floor, it's going to it's going to cause a surplus. It's going to create unemployment in the labor market. But we got a lot of questions to ask. First, is it binding? Second, who's going to be unemployed? How are they affected? So on and so forth. There's a lot of other things you have to think about. Also, the sort of dynamic context that the static supply and demand model is going to lose. Same thing here with the rent control, right? All right, so let's look at the Econ 101 picture, though. What's the effect of the rent control policy? I've already said we would be a little bit suspicious, but the model's going to give us some really good intuition. And we need this intuition to be able to think about what's going to happen in the real world. Okay, so the standard Econ 101 picture is we have our demand for rental units, we have our supply for rental units, we have this price ceiling which looks at maybe about 7% increase annually, right? The price is not allowed to rise above here. So it's not a problem in the first period because the true equilibrium price is here. Now I have a non-binding price ceiling, everything's fine, right? Equilibrium price and quantity is right here, where everyone who wants to rent an apartment is able to find one. Every landlord is able to find a renter. Okay, wonderful. What happens if we get an increase in demand, right? What happens if demand for rental units rises due to population growth or even a recession that causes incomes to fall to the point that people struggle to pay mortgages? Look, so with this rent control law, right, Oregon's hoping to be able to help those with lower incomes. That's the sort of reading between the lines. That's the goal. It's a compelling social goal. It's well-intentioned, and it's admirable. So, but let me give you a situation in which the increase in demand could be precisely from those we want to help, right? So there's going to be a recession at some point in the near future. Or I shouldn't say near, but some point in the future, right? When there's a recession, consumer incomes fall, people lose their job, people fail to make mortgage payments, and a lot of people go from owning to renting, right? So we saw this with the Great Recession. Saw a lot of people moving into my apartment complex that I was living in at the time, anecdotally, seemed to be moving from houses, right? It was kind of sad to see. So what could happen is if there's a recession, consumer incomes fall, we get this massive increase in demand. You have a lot of people who would much rather pay a rising rental rates to rent an apartment than their mortgage, right? So anyway, so the point is you can get this increase in demand for a variety of reasons. Could be from population growth, could be an influx of people coming to take jobs in Portland, whatever. Either way, I guess the reasoning at a certain point doesn't matter so much. We're going to get an increase in demand. So here's what I've drawn. I have no idea what that was doing. So that's kind of bizarre. Okay, so here we have Here we have my original demand for rental units. Here we have our supply of rental units, and then we have our original equilibrium quantity. Then after this increase in demand, here's our new equilibrium. Here's a new equilibrium quantity, and but the problem is we've got this rent control. We have this rent control. We have this price ceiling. Price is not allowed to rise higher than this point. What's the problem? Well, the quantity supplied, the number of apartments available at this price is here. The quantity demanded, the number of apartments desired at this price is here. So we're going to get what? A massive shortage. Okay, so here's rental units demanded at the rent controlled ceiling, and then here's the number supplied, right? So there's a problem, and we can think about what's going on. Well, there's a shortage. Quantity demanded is larger than quantity supplied. The magnitude of the shortage is given by between these green arrows, and the shortage is due to the fact that there's more people who would like to buy the apartments at this price than apartments available. Now we can identify winners and losers. So we have some people who are able to get apartments between Q1 and QS are able to get apartments, and they pay this price instead of that price. So they gain substantially, right? You have a few people gaining quite a bit. And then what about these people between here and here? So between Q1 and between QS and Q2 star. Well, let's see. So these are the people who would have been able to rent an apartment if the price was allowed to rise, but are not allowed to rent an apartment at this price because there's none offered. So those people lose out. They lost the ability to rent an apartment. That's bad. And then what about the people between Q2 star and QD? Well, these people are part of our shortage. They're in line waiting, trying to get an apartment, but they wouldn't have been in the market at the equilibrium price. They're only interested in renting at this artificially low price. So maybe we feel a little bit differently about these people who are unable to find an apartment because they wouldn't have wanted one here. However, these people would have wanted one at that price. Okay, and that was my comment here. The basic idea, though, is that this rent control is going to introduce a lot of inefficiency in the form of a shortage. Now, the size of the relative displacement effects are going to be governed by a couple things, because we might be interested in how large is this shortage? How large is the gain to those who are paying less compared to the loss to those unable to find apartments? Well, the relative size of those things is going to be governed by things like the relative magnitude of the price control relative to the equilibrium, right? Is the price controlled price pretty close to the equilibrium or pretty far, right? If landlords would have wanted to raise their price by 10% or 8% and it's pretty close to the 7%, okay. But if landlords would have wanted to be raising their price like 15%, then there's substantially greater distortion. The other thing that matters is the relative elasticity of supply and demand. Elasticity is going to tell us something about how responsive landlords and renters are to the change in price. So you think about the relative steepness of the lines, right? Anyway, another issue is we want to think about the long run effects. So the short run effects are the shortage. The long run effects, well, the shortage is going to persist, and there's some other bad things. One is that we might expect the rental units fall into disrepair, right? Why bother investing in them if you can't recoup the benefit of that investment? The other thing is we'd expect actually the price that renters are going to pay, those who are successful in renting the apartment, is going to rise due to the fact that, well, they're going to have to wait in line. They're going to be in a queue waiting to be able to get the apartment. There's going to be search costs. They're going to have to find some buyer's agent to be able to find the rental for them. And we might expect landlords are going to use clever tactics to be able to extract something closer to the equilibrium price, right? Maybe they'll sell a furnished apartment and they'll say, oh yeah, the apartment, the increase in the rent you're paying is due to, 7% is due to the increase in the value of the apartment. But the furnishings we've put in this apartment we've given you have appreciated, right? So maybe they'll come up with clever ways to be able to extract greater surplus, either through bundling or through something that looks more like tying. So now I want to talk about the advanced pricing criticism, and this has to do with the way that the economics of renting works, which is that part of what gets built into the pricing is the fact that the landlords are thinking about a long-run problem. The renter very often, and often to their detriment, is taking a short-run view. They're thinking year to year, month to month, but the landlord is thinking about a longer-run view. And so what happens is, initially landlords want to set a low price, low introductory price to make their dwelling look relatively more attractive. More people want to live there. And so you're given this low introductory price, and then after you've moved in, you live there for a year, you find that your rent is going to be rising, sometimes substantially, $50, $100, $200. Why? Well, the landlord knows that the renter's switching costs have risen. You've got all your stuff there, you've got an apartment. To be able to find another place, now you have to find another place, right? So you have to find another place to live. You have to move your stuff, and you have to get a new routine, right? And all of this on top of maybe you're working, maybe you're going to school. So you might just not want to bother with it. To the extent that it's a really big pain to have to move, to find a new place, and to the extent, for instance, I might be willing to pay an extra $20 or $200 per month rather than move, that's what the landlord will charge. That's what they do in places like Chicago, right? If you got your stuff up in an apartment building in Chicago, downtown Chicago or somewhere high rise, you don't want to move because it's a pain to move. And so the landlords know that, so they're going to be able to sort of extract surplus. Now, okay, so this might all sound bad. It might sound like they're taking advantage of the renters. I mean, to some extent, of course they are. They've got some degree of market power, which is part of why the standard Econ 101 picture doesn't fit so well for the Oregon price control law. Anyway, but it might seem bad at first, but a lot of this kind of gets accounted for by the landlord across several months, right? So they're thinking of this relationship with this renter across several months, right? 12 months, 18 months, 24, 36 months, and they're thinking about spreading out the rent across that time frame so that, yeah, they're going to give you a discount initially, but they're going to be able to make up for it in the end. So that's how the landlord's looking at the problem. The renter, they've got a much shorter view, right? And so they're just seeing, oh, this is my rent now, and then when it rises, they feel this very strong loss, right? It's sort of like a loss aversion issue as well. So whereas the renter has a short-run view and then kind of maybe gets sort of lulled into the status quo and gets a sticker shock when the price rises, landlord has a long-run view. And so what's the problem? Well, a price control that doesn't allow rent to rise will actually undermine these dynamics and make profitability more of a challenge, right? And make competing for, basically it'll certainly change the pricing strategies of landlords in this state going forward. So anyhow, as they say, like and subscribe and check out some of my other videos.